The George Floyd Tragedy, Part 2. When the George Floyd news story broke on a nationwide level, the mainstream media knew many of the details of this local news story. They selectively edited much of the details of what happened on the day of George Floyd's death. The media's goal was to inflame racial tensions, to cause rioting, looting, burning of entire city blocks, murder and mayhem, solely for ratings and the profits that came with ratings. This is the worst example of journalistic malpractice that we've seen in our lifetimes. The news media wanted death and destruction, and they wanted increased racial animosity based on the fact that they did not report specific details about the choices that George Floyd made prior to his death. Now, George Floyd did not deserve to die. George Floyd was a victim for those 8 minutes that he was pinned down to the pavement of Minneapolis by those police officers. There's no disputing that. But let's take a moment to look at these 3 news stories which detail the choices that George Floyd made on the day of his death. We start with this NPR news story on the medical examiner's autopsy. After skipping a bunch of completely meaningless details, let's look at something that's very important. George Floyd, age 46, was a middle-aged male. Multiple news stories referred to him as a young man. They were wrong. He was 46 years old. He was a middle-aged man. A 46-year-old man should be making choices during his day that avoid a physical altercation with police. If we scroll down to the autopsy report from the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office, we find some appropriate information. In addition to fentanyl and methamphetamine, the toxicology report from the autopsy showed that Floyd also had cannabinoids in his system when he died. Now, these drugs were not prescribed by a doctor for Mr. Floyd. He was taking illegal recreational drugs which impaired his judgment and affected the choices he made on the day of his death. Floyd also had heart disease and hypertension. Now, even if he didn't know these specific diagnoses, again, go back to his age, he knew the limitations of his own body. He knew that he could not do the same things at the age of 46 that a 20-year-old George Floyd could do. The owner of the store, Mahmoud, wishes that the police had never been called. The national news media left out several details about what George Floyd, shopper, did that day. George Floyd attempted to defraud a minority-owned business, Cup Foods. Cup Foods was the backdrop for the press conference by George Floyd's brother calling for peace and calm after the rioting and looting of Minneapolis. George Floyd purchased cigarettes using counterfeit money at this minority-owned business and was a long-time community store serving black, white, and Hispanic residents who lived there. The 911 transcript, as printed by the New York Daily News. The date of this is May 29th. That's only 4 days after the autopsy of George Floyd. It's from the clerk working at Cup Foods that day. He called in this report. He stated that George Floyd gave fake bills, plural, not one counterfeit bill, as was reported on the national news media, multiple fake bills. This would indicate that George Floyd did not do this by accident, that he was willfully attempting to defraud Cup Foods of their merchandise. Once the clerk realized that George Floyd had passed them counterfeit money, they ran outside to confront him. Very strangely, George Floyd was sitting on his car. It's so odd that the clerk notes this twice in their 911 call. Now here's the amazing part, and this was shocking news. Again, the national news media had access to this transcript. They chose not to report this information. The clerk gave George Floyd a choice. the clerk told George Floyd to return the stolen merchandise, to just leave and go home. You can go home, George Floyd. But he doesn't want to do that. George Floyd refused to leave. The clerk at Cup Foods had no choice but to follow the law and call 911, who then dispatched the police. Now, if we zoom back from this and go back to the nationwide level, there's clearly an agenda here by nationwide politicians to somehow milk political advantage over George Floyd's death. People posing in African scarves obviously haven't the slightest concern about the death of George Floyd, and the news media wanted to make money off of his death. They didn't care who got hurt, what businesses were destroyed, what mayhem was caused by omitting these crucial details. If you Google a phrase, resignations demanded over George Floyd, as I did, you'll find that no one is being asked to resign in Minneapolis, where George Floyd died, or the state of Minnesota. The reason is those politicians in Minneapolis and Minnesota are all Democrat. It's been a Democrat-run state since 1932. Instead, you have all sorts of random people all over the country being told they should resign. Usually they're Republicans. And everyone demanding resignations is simply doing so for political advantage. That has nothing to do with honoring George Floyd's memory. Now, during those 8 minutes where George Floyd's life passed, he was a victim for those 8 minutes. But as these 3 stories clearly illustrate, George Floyd made a series of very bad choices that day. If he had changed any one of these bad choices, he might still be alive. If he hadn't taken illegal drugs, if he had acknowledged his physical condition wasn't up to committing a criminal act, if he hadn't gone into this store with the intent to defraud a minority-owned business, if he had chosen to leave the scene of the crime after returning the merchandise, the clerk was going to let him go. He could have lived, and all this could have been avoided. I wish for America to be at peace, and I hope that reading these 3 stories, and I've provided links on the video for you to read these stories yourself, I hope this has edified you on the nature of what happened to George Floyd, how the national news media sculpted the facts to fit their narrative, their slant, and how crass politicians even today are seeking to benefit off of his untimely and unnecessary death. Let us get back to an America that is one nation, indivisible, under God, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.